Hello, my friends. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments so we can see how far these stories travel. And don't forget to subscribe with notifications on, so YouTube keeps bringing you more chilling stories like these. Story 1. The air smelled like damp pine needles and the faint metallic tang of exposed iron in the dirt. It was my third day solo on the Continental Divide Trail, maybe 20 miles past the last sign of civilization, and I was feeling that perfect blend of physical exhaustion and mental clarity. Just the silence, the crunch of my boots, and the endless, ragged peaks. I stopped near a massive, sun-bleached granite boulder, a landmark I'd noted on my map to stretch my calves before the final climb of the day. As I sat down, my hand landed on something that wasn't rock or moss. It was a patch of earth that felt strangely loose. My curiosity, the same thing that pushes me to hike hundreds of miles alone, immediately kicked in. It took maybe 10 minutes of digging with my small trowel, mostly to convince myself I wasn't wasting energy on a rodent's nest. But the dirt gave way too easily, not the packed sediment of a forest floor, but freshly turned soil, covered with a layer of pine straw carefully placed over the top. Then, the shovel hit something hard. It wasn't a geocache. Geocaches are friendly, usually painted bright colors and filled with trinkets. This was a heavy, olive-drab pelican case, the kind used for high-end camera gear or military equipment, maybe 2 feet long. It was sealed with heavy-duty black duct tape and strapped tightly with 3 thick nylon zip ties. My heart started thumping against my ribs, not from the exertion, but from the sudden, cold spike of knowing I just stepped into a story that wasn't mine. I scraped the remaining dirt off and lifted it. It had serious weight, maybe 30 pounds. What was so important that someone would bury it this deep, this far from anywhere? I checked the GPS coordinates on my phone, even though I knew the answer. I was in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't a forgotten treasure. This was a dead drop. A tiny voice in the back of my head screamed, "Leave it. Put the dirt back, cover your tracks, and hike out now." But the heavier, more insistent voice of pure human greed and morbid curiosity won. I couldn't just leave it. I had to know. I used my knife to saw through the thick zip ties, the plastic groaning in protest. The duct tape came off in sticky, stubborn strips. The latches clicked open with a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the quiet afternoon. I lifted the lid. It wasn't camera gear. It wasn't money. Inside, nestled in thick foam padding, were 2 objects. On the left, a large, vacuum-sealed plastic bag full of small, clear diamonds, glittering with a cold, unnatural brilliance under the weak afternoon sun. On the right, wrapped tightly in a cotton rag, was a handgun, a compact, serious-looking piece of hardware. It wasn't a hunter's rifle. It was a weapon meant for close, quiet business. The air rushed out of my lungs. This wasn't just a treasure. This was evidence. Stolen goods. And the kind of people who deal in stolen diamonds and buried guns aren't the kind who forgive accidental discovery. I slammed the lid shut, the sound echoing through the trees, and my whole body started shaking. I had maybe an hour and a half of daylight left. I had to get away from this spot. I didn't rebury it. I couldn't. Instead, I shoved the case deep into the rhododendron thicket next to the boulder and piled a heap of dead branches on top. The diamonds and the gun were still in the case, but the knowledge was in my head, a terrifying, heavy secret. I scrambled up the trail until I found a decent campsite maybe half a mile higher up, a small, hidden clearing just off the main path. I pitched my tent in record time, my hands clumsy with adrenaline. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. How long had the case been there? Who was coming for it, and when? I ate a cold dinner, unable to stomach the idea of starting a fire. The smoke was too visible. The sun dropped behind the peaks, dragging the temperature down and plunging the forest into a deep, heavy blackness. The air itself felt thick with dread. At 10:47 p.m., I was curled in my sleeping bag. my knife gripped in my clammy hand when I heard it. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was the distinct, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a trekking pole hitting stone coming from down the trail. Someone was hiking in the pitch black, and they weren't using a headlamp. A seasoned hiker wouldn't risk breaking an ankle without light, not on this uneven terrain. And if they were using a light, they were keeping it off for a reason. My blood ran cold. I pressed my ear against the tent floor. The tapping stopped. Then I heard a different sound, the sound of digging. It was faint, muffled by the distance, but unmistakable. The scrape of metal against dirt, right where I had been earlier. They were at the boulder. My throat tightened. They knew where to look, which meant they were the ones who had buried it, and they were finding loose dirt and a lack of a pelican case. The digging stopped, replaced by a low, guttural curse, too far away to make out the words, but radiating pure, focused anger. Silence descended again, but it was a vicious, taut silence, the kind before a lightning strike. My mind raced. Did I leave any sign? Did the fresh dirt I scraped onto the brush lead them toward my hiding spot? No, I was a half-mile uphill. They had to know something was wrong, though. Something was missing. Then the second sound. It was the soft but definite click-click of a focused beam flashlight being turned on and immediately angled downwards, sweeping low along the forest floor, searching for tracks. They were coming after me. They weren't going to give up, not with that kind of cargo at stake. I unzipped my tent door just enough to peer out into the night. The moon was a sliver, offering no help. The shadows were absolute. A few minutes later, the light beam, a tight, powerful white circle, flickered through the trees far below, snaking its way up the trail. It was moving slowly, deliberately, scanning the ground. The person holding it was careful, almost methodical. They weren't panicked. They were hunting. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart hammering out of rhythm. I had to ditch the cache. Having it anywhere near me was a death sentence. I grabbed my pack, tossed in my water and a granola bar, and left everything else. The tent, the stove, the rest of my food. A desperate decoy. I didn't need the trail was where he expected me. I needed the off-trail. I plunged into the woods opposite the path, moving painfully slow, trying to step only on moss or rock to silence my movement. The branches clawed at my face and pack, but the noise of my own fear was louder than the forest. I crept maybe 100 yards until the slope steepened and the trees thinned into a rocky scree field. I stopped and held my breath, listening for the hunter. The flashlight beam was closer now, illuminating the trunk of a ponderosa on the trail maybe 60 yards away. I could hear the crunch of a boot on gravel, a heavier, less athletic stride than a typical hiker. He's close, too close. I yanked the pelican case out of my pack. It was now an anchor, a beacon, a curse. I couldn't carry it any further, but I couldn't just leave it either, not where he might easily find it. I spotted a dark, narrow crevice in the rocks, hidden beneath an overhang, a geological wound in the mountainside. I heaved the heavy case into the crevice. It scraped down the rock with a loud, sickening sound. Crash. My blood froze. The sound, muffled as it was loud enough to carry. The flashlight beam on the trail snapped around and pointed directly at my location. It was a solid, blinding white shaft piercing the darkness. "I know you're there," a voice called out. It was low, gravelly, and utterly devoid of panic, the voice of a predator who knows he has his prey cornered. "I just want the case. No one needs to get hurt. Just leave it and walk away." I didn't answer. I backed up quickly, scrambling up the loose rock, trying to gain elevation and distance. I could hear his boots leaving the trail, crunching on the scree below me. He was moving faster now. "Don't be stupid," he yelled, the sound echoing off the rock face. "Those are my things. You didn't see anything. Throw the case out and I'll forget I saw your face." I heard a metallic schnick, the sound of a knife blade extending, or perhaps a slide being racked on a weapon. I reached the top of the scree field and dove behind a thick clump of juniper bushes, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the exposed stone. Below me, the man's flashlight beam danced wildly, sweeping back and forth, getting closer. Then I saw him, a large man not dressed like a hiker but in dark, heavy clothes. He was holding something that glinted in the light. He was standing right where I'd thrown the case, peering into the dark crevice. He must have seen the dark shape, because he dropped to his knees and jammed his arm into the fissure. He grunted with effort, struggling to pull the heavy case out of the tight spot. This was my only chance. I took the largest rock I could lift, maybe 20 pounds of sharp granite, and used both hands to heave it over the edge. It fell silently for a terrifying second, then hit the rocks right above the crevice with a deafening, splintering crack. The man below screamed, a short, sharp sound of pain and surprise, and his flashlight dropped, spinning wildly on the ground. For a second, the beam illuminated his face, contorted, furious, and bleeding from a scrape on his cheek. He didn't grab the gun. He just grabbed the case, yanking it free from the crevice. "You're dead," he roared, clutching the case in one arm and reaching for his waistband with the other. I didn't wait to see what he pulled out. I turned and ran, not back toward the trail, but higher, toward the ridge line, where the jagged peaks cut the black sky. I didn't have the diamonds, but he had the case, and the last thing he'd seen was my outline against the starlight. The knowledge was the heaviest thing I carried. He was angry, armed, and maybe a quarter mile behind me. He wasn't going back down. He was going to climb. He had the prize, but I had the high ground and the knowledge of the terrain. The next few hours before the sun came up were going to be a brutal, terrifying race for survival on the knife edge of a mountain. Could I find a spot on the ridge that offered a defense? Or was I just climbing toward a more exposed death? And why was a few pounds of polished rock worth murdering a total stranger? The night was long, and the hunter was close behind. Story 2. I've been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail for 6 weeks, and I pride myself on having an eye for the environment. I see the signs, the compression of pine needles that means a deer passed through, the faint scuff mark on a rock that shows where a boot slid, and most importantly, the blazes. The trail markers, they are the gospel out here. It was mid-afternoon, hot and dry in the high desert scrub of southern Oregon. I was tired, mentally crunching the miles to the next water source when I noticed the first anomaly. A large square blaze, a piece of painted blue aluminum nailed high on an old-growth ponderosa pine, looked wrong. I stopped, pulled my pack off, and walked back 20 feet. The blue wasn't the faded, sun-baked shade I'd been seeing for days. It was a slightly brighter, fresher shade, and the edges of the square were too crisp. It was new. Why would a decades-old national trail have a brand-new blaze right next to one that was clearly much older and weathered? I told myself it was routine maintenance. Someone replaced a damaged marker. I took a swig of water and moved on. 10 minutes later, I came to a switchback. There, where the trail curved sharply around a boulder field, I saw another blue blaze. This one was nailed to a dead log lying parallel to the path. It was a bizarre placement. Markers are usually placed upright on standing trees, where they can be seen from both directions. I walked past the log and glanced back. The marker was visible from the way I'd just come. But as I hiked forward, I realized the trail itself was getting narrower, the footpath less defined, and the low-hanging branches of manzanita were starting to scratch my shins. It felt less like a heavily maintained trail and more like an animal track. Is this a new reroute? I pulled out my physical map and checked the GPS. According to the map, the trail should be wide and heading almost due north. My compass, however, showed I was gradually drifting west. I kept walking, convincing myself the map detail was just imprecise. Then I hit the third marker. This one was a scrap of blue plastic tied with coarse twine to a branch, barely at eye level. This was definitely not standard PCT marking. It looked hurried, temporary, and it was positioned at a point where the main, clear path, a path with older, faded markers, veered off to the left, while this new, makeshift blaze seemed to guide me to the right, into a dense, thorny thicket. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, listening only to the buzzing of cicadas. Someone was deliberately marking a false trail. The question wasn't if, but why. Was it a misguided local trying to confuse hikers, or something darker? My stomach tightened. I realized the last legitimate, faded, official blue blaze I'd seen was over an hour ago. All the markers since then, the new aluminum square, the bizarrely placed log blaze, and now this scrap of plastic, were leading me away from the established route. I decided to backtrack immediately. I swung my pack around, and that's when I heard the sound that confirmed my worst fears. It wasn't a snap or a crash. It was a smooth, metallic slide, maybe 30 yards back down the path I'd just come from. It sounded exactly like the quiet closing of a truck door. Whoever had been setting the false trail was now behind me. They hadn't expected me to stop, to scrutinize the markers, or to turn around. They expected me to blindly follow their redirection. I dropped my pack behind the thicket, scrambling silently into the dense brush. I wasn't running yet. I was hiding, watching. A few tense minutes later, a figure stepped into the small clearing. It wasn't a hiker. He was wearing dark, nondescript work clothes, not the bright, high-vis trail gear of a volunteer or ranger. He was carrying a worn leather satchel, and in his hand was a small, handheld staple gun and a roll of the same blue plastic marking tape. He walked straight past where I'd just been standing, ignoring the true path entirely. He followed the direction of the bizarre plastic marker I'd just spotted, heading straight into the thicket I had avoided. He wasn't following me. He was checking his work. He was making sure the trail was properly closed, and the new, false route was clearly marked. As he disappeared into the brush, my mind finally put the pieces together. I wasn't being led astray randomly. I was being diverted off the main corridor of the PCT. Was there something they didn't want a long-distance hiker to see? A hidden operation? A camp? I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I had to get back to the main trail and fast, but going backward seemed too risky. He was still out there, possibly laying more traps, and he would eventually realize I hadn't come through his marked path. I retrieved my pack and plunged into the woods on the opposite side of the true trail, parallel to the direction I should be going, making a wide, silent arc around the area I suspected he was marking. I needed to bypass him and then cut back to the real trail. The terrain became a nightmare, thick patches of deadfall and thorny bushes. I hiked low, keeping my profile small, moving like a thief in the deepening shadows. After what felt like an hour, the sun was sinking rapidly. The light became a hazy orange wash, and the air cooled, carrying with it the scent of dust and fear. I calculated I must be well past the man and decided to cut east, back toward the sound of what should be the main trail. When I finally broke through a screen of fir trees, my blood ran cold. I hadn't found the PCT. I had found a dirt 2-track road, and sitting parked beside it was the source of the metallic slide I'd heard earlier, an old, dusty, beat-up pickup truck. But that wasn't the paralyzing part. The paralyzing part was the scene just beyond the truck, a small, dry clearing, and in the middle of it, a crude, 3-sided shelter built from salvaged corrugated metal and camouflage netting. And in front of the shelter, 2 other men, bigger, harder looking than the first, were talking in low, intense voices. They had a small fire going, and scattered on the ground around them were tools, plastic drums, and rolls of thick, industrial plastic sheeting. This was more than a hidden camp. It had the look of an isolated, illegal operation. I crouched low behind a boulder, my heart hammering like a drum solo. They were maybe 50 yards away, backs mostly toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the second man, the one who looked like the boss, picked up a large, high-powered radio transceiver from the ground. He fiddled with the antenna, pressed the transmit button, and spoke. His voice was too low for me to catch the words, but the tone was urgent. A moment later, the first man, the one with the blue plastic tape, emerged from the woods directly opposite me, exactly where I had been earlier. He looked furious. He spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the cool evening air. He didn't take the loop. I found the pack marks. They stopped right at the turn. He went off trail into the brush. He knows. He must know. The boss slammed his radio down. Go, find his tracks. He can't get out of the drainage before morning. If he saw this, he's a liability. The marker man spun around, pulling something long and dark from his belt. I couldn't tell if it was a machete or a club, but it was meant for damage. He headed back into the trees, moving fast, starting to cast his eyes high and low for any sign of my passage. I was trapped. Below me was the illegal camp. Above me, the sun was almost gone, and a very angry man was hunting my tracks through the underbrush. I had to use the one thing they weren't expecting, the trail itself, the real trail. I made a wide, desperate sweep, running low along the base of the ridge until I found the familiar, compressed dirt of the PCT. I jumped onto the path, abandoning my attempt to stay hidden, and began running as fast as my tired legs could carry me. I ran for a solid 15 minutes, barely glancing back, the sound of my boots heavy and relentless. I didn't slow until I saw the unmistakable sign of civilization in the darkness, a reflection of light. It was a small wooden signpost for an old, disused fire road, and beside it, a faded, official trail register box. I scrabbled at the lid, fumbling for the pen. I knew I couldn't call the police, but I could leave a message. My hands shaking violently, I ripped open the register book and scrawled a single line at the bottom of the last hiker's entry. Illegal camp S of R3 men, SABOTAGED trail, blue tape loop, truck at ridge, north 42 degrees, 8.452, west 122 degrees, 11.901. I slammed the box shut, ensuring the pen and paper were secure. My heart was still racing, but the panic had been replaced by a grim determination. I kept running down the trail. I didn't stop until I saw the bright, welcoming glow of a distant town's lights on the horizon. I finally found safety at a road crossing nearly 5 miles later, flagging down an RV that pulled over just before midnight. I never knew what they were doing in that clearing: drugs, illegal logging, maybe something worse. But I knew one thing: if I had blindly followed that bright, false blue loop into the thickening brush, I would have walked right into their isolated little trap. The thought of that quiet, controlled redirection was far more terrifying than any sudden ambush. The register entry was my insurance, my way of making sure their secret didn't die with me on the mountain. Story 3. They say the desert is the true test of a hiker's sanity, but I always found the deep canyons of the Colorado Plateau to be far more unsettling. Out here, the rock absorbs sound, and the air just sits, heavy and still. I was 3 days into a self-imposed isolation loop in a slot canyon system so remote it didn't have a name, just coordinates. I was looking for silence, but the silence I found felt loaded. It started subtly on the second afternoon. I was filtering water from a stagnant pothole, my head down, when I heard something that was definitely not wind and definitely not a canyon wren. It was a sound like sand being dragged across stone, a slow, gritty shoo-shoos that seemed to come from right behind the towering sandstone wall of the canyon. I froze. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing. I decided it was a loose rock settling or maybe a tiny, unseen collapse of a rim overhang. Out here, your mind plays tricks. You have to shut that down. But that night, the tricks got louder. I set up my bivy sack in a small, sandy alcove carved into the canyon wall, hopping to be protected from a potential flash flood. The moon was high and bright, making the red rock glow like a dying ember, but it also cast shadows that danced with every minor shift of my eyes. I was lying there trying to read by headlamp when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a sound of movement, but a sound of vocalization. It was a whisper. Faint, high-pitched, and distorted, like someone talking through a thick tube of fabric. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I could recognize. It was just a rhythmic, unsettling sibilance. A long S sound followed by something that sounded like a question, then a repeated clicking noise. I snapped off my headlamp, plunging the alcove into darkness. My heart started beating a fast, hollow drum against the sand. It's the wind. The acoustics of the canyon are distorting the wind. That was the rational explanation. I clung to it like a lifeline. These canyons are natural echo chambers, creating sonic illusions. But the whispers didn't sound like air. They sounded like intention. They sounded like they were coming from a specific point above me, on the canyon rim, hundreds of feet up. I spent the rest of the night rigid, listening. The whispering didn't stop entirely, but it became sporadic, mixed with the unsettling shoosh-shoosh of something dragging itself along the slick rock. It felt like someone, or something, was scouting the canyon, using the high ground to watch my every move. Who would be up there? This route was unpublished, unmarked, and required a full technical rappel just to get in. No casual hiker would ever find this place. When the sun finally crested the rim, flooding the canyon with glorious, warm light, the sounds vanished completely. I felt a wave of shame. Altitude sickness, dehydration, fatigue. One of them must have finally cracked my solid control. I packed up fast, determined to cover serious distance and hike out of this system by the next day. I ignored my fear and tried to focus on my route finding. A few hours into the hike, navigating a series of shallow pools, I saw something that ripped the rational explanation right out of my hands. Lying on a patch of slick rock near the edge of a plunge pool was a small, smooth, oval stone. Not unusual, but etched crudely into the stone, deep enough to catch the light, was a single symbol. It looked like a broken triangle with a vertical line through it. I immediately recognized it. It wasn't a modern trail marker. It was the same kind of archaic symbol I'd seen photographs of, marks left by pre-Columbian cultures, warning or guiding signals. It had to be hundreds of years old. But then I looked closer. The edges of the etchings were too clean. The lines were too crisp. This stone wasn't old. It had been placed here recently. It was a modern marker deliberately mimicking an ancient one. And right next to it, partially buried in the sand, was a boot print. Not mine. It was smaller, narrower, and the sole was a brand I didn't recognize. A cheap, aggressive tread. My breath hitched. The whisperer wasn't a figment of my imagination. Someone was down here with me, and they were leaving signs that they thought I wouldn't understand. My internal panic meter shot up. This wasn't a search and rescue situation. This was calculated intrusion. Was it a recluse? A criminal using the remote location as a hideout? And why were they whispering and marking my path? I ditched the rest of my planned route and started heading for the nearest exit canyon, moving with a desperate, silent speed. As the afternoon wore on, I saw more of the stones. Not many, maybe 4 or 5, always placed in a subtle spot where you'd only see them if you were looking down for your footing, or if you knew they were there. Each one had that strange, broken triangle symbol. It was a message. Was it a warning to stay away, or was it a breadcrumb trail for me? The ambiguity was terrifying. I reached a section of the canyon that was sheer and narrow, a true slot. The only way through was by scrambling up a choked debris field of boulders. It was physically exhausting, but the walls were so close I felt protected. I kept moving until dusk, finally finding a barely adequate small ledge about 20 feet up the canyon wall that offered a commanding view of the floor. This time, I didn't set up the bivy. I just sat, motionless, covered by my tarp, waiting for the night. The moment the light was completely gone, the whispering started again. It was closer now, much closer and louder. The sound seemed to rise from the dark, cavernous space beneath the ledge. It was the same distorted, high-pitched sibilance, but this time I could make out something rhythmic beneath the sound, a low, mechanical clacking. Click-clack, click-clack. It sounded like a ratchet, or maybe a reel, and the whispers seemed to be responding to it, rising and falling in intensity. I realized with sickening clarity that the sounds weren't traveling hundreds of feet from the rim. The whispers weren't coming from a person's mouth. The click-clack was the mechanical part. The whispering was the recorded, distorted output. Was I being stalked by someone using a concealed directional speaker, playing back a sound meant to terrify and disorient? But why? To scare me off, to herd me. The sounds intensified, seeming to move past my position, down the canyon floor. The whisperer was passing directly beneath me. I gripped the edge of the ledge, fighting the urge to lean over and look. I didn't want him to know I was there, but the curiosity was a physical pain in my chest. Then the whisper stopped suddenly, dead silence. A flashlight beam snapped on, not directly at the ground but aimed high, illuminating the smooth wall of the opposite canyon. The beam then swung quickly across my wall, a fast, deliberate sweep. He was searching. He knew I was near. Or he was checking every nook and cranny. The beam swept past my hidden ledge, so close I could feel the faint warmth of the light. I pressed myself flat against the rock, barely breathing. The light stopped sweeping and held steady, fixed on a spot 20 feet below my ledge. Then the man's voice, not a whisper but a normal, rough male voice, cut through the silence. "You really think you can hide from the sound?" he called out, his voice echoing eerily. "You think you're smart because you found the marks?" My stomach dropped. He knew I'd seen the symbols. He had been watching my progress all day, setting the ancient markers as a taunt, confirming his success when he saw me slow down and look at them. He paused, then added, his tone changing to one of chilling, quiet certainty. "The triangle is a boundary. You crossed it. Now you've got two choices. Stay up there and freeze by morning, or come down and we can talk about what you saw." I hadn't seen anything. Nothing but a man with a spool of tape and a speaker. But he believed I had seen something incriminating. And he was standing 20 feet beneath me, knowing I was trapped on a small, exposed shelf. I couldn't stay. I had to go up. I knew there was an emergency bolt ladder hidden beneath an overhang about 50 feet above my current position, a way up to the rim used only by maintenance crews. I'd researched it months ago. It was my only way out. Using only my fingertips, I grabbed the thin, spiny roots of a desert willow growing precariously from a crack above me. I started the agonizingly slow climb, scraping my boots silently against the rock face, praying the desert willow was strong enough. Below, the man started climbing toward my ledge, a slow, patient scramble. "I can hear you scratching, hiker," he called up, his voice close now. "It's a long way to fall." I ignored him, my focus absolute. I reached the overhang, my arms screaming, and found the small, camouflaged iron ring. I clipped into the first bolt, testing it, then started ascending the rusted, shuddering ladder. When I reached the rim, gasping for air, I looked down. The man was on my ledge, shining his light into the empty tarp. He let out a yell of pure, frustrated rage. I didn't stop to look back at the abyss. I ran across the open, dark mesa, the sand flying behind my boots. I could hear his shouts echoing up from the canyon, but he couldn't follow me immediately. The bolt ladder was too exposed and slow. I ran until I hit the rough, dusty outline of a seldom used dirt road. I ran another 3 miles along it until my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a cluster of scrub oaks as the first hint of gray dawn touched the sky. I never found out what he was hiding in that canyon, or why a simple hiker's presence warranted such a terrifying theatrical response. But I knew one thing: I hadn't gone crazy. There was a whisperer. He was real. and his terror campaign had been so effective that for hours I was convinced the man hunting me was only a shadow of my own mind. And that, more than anything, was the most unnerving realization of all. I survived the physical threat, but the seed of doubt about my own perception was planted, and I didn't know how to dig it out. Story 4. The forecast had called for flurries. Flurries. That word should be retired from the mountain lexicon, because what hit me at 14,000 feet was not flurries. It was a white, howling, immediate apocalypse. I was high up in the Cascades, doing a late-season solo traverse of a jagged ridge line. The morning had been brilliant, cold but clear, with a sun that felt deceptively warm. I'd summited one of the major peaks by noon and was moving fast down the backside, aiming for the shelter hut before dark. Then, around 3 p.m., the sky went from blue to bruised purple in minutes. The wind hit like a solid wall, stealing my breath and nearly knocking me off the narrow, ice-slick spine of the trail. The snow didn't fall. It was instantly airborne, horizontal, and dense. It was a quick freeze event, trapping moisture in me simultaneously. I pulled my goggles down and tightened the hood of my shell, but the visibility dropped to maybe 5 feet. I couldn't see the trail, the markers, or even the tips of my own skis. I was navigating by feel, using the angle of the slope to keep from tumbling into the abyss. And then it happened. A sudden, unseen drop-off in the snow line. My left ski snagged on an exposed rock, snapping violently. I tumbled down the slope for maybe 30 feet, a chaotic mess of gear and flying snow, before fetching up hard against a large, buried drift. My left leg screamed in agony. I didn't need to check. The sharp, nauseating pain in my lower shin told me I was done, broken, or at the very least, badly fractured. I lay there for a minute, hyperventilating into my buff, tasting the metallic tang of fear. The temperature was dropping so fast I could feel the moisture freezing on my eyelashes. I was injured, immobile, and the world was dissolving in a blizzard. My odds had just plummeted from challenging to desperate. I managed to unclip my boots and drag myself a few feet, pulling my pack with me. I needed immediate shelter. I spotted a cluster of 3 enormous, wind-beaten pines whose low branches formed a dense, snow-covered cave. I crawled into the tight space, kicking away the snow with my good leg. Once inside, sheltered slightly from the immediate wind, I pulled out my emergency kit. I splinted my shin using my trekking pole and a length of foam sleeping pad, tying it tight with medical tape. The pain was blinding, but the cold was the bigger enemy. I pulled out my down bag and bivy sack, crawled in and zipped up tight. I checked my supplies. A liter of water already starting to slush, 2 freeze-dried meals, a satellite phone, and a tiny canister of fuel for my stove. I had maybe 48 hours tops. I hit the distress button on my satellite phone. I got the connection, heard the faint, beautiful chirp of the signal sending, and then the blizzard roared to life again, drowning out everything. I saw the signal lost message flash on the screen. The weather was too violent. I was completely cut off. I checked my watch, 7:15 p.m. The high-tension part of the night was just beginning. I was shivering violently, but the fear was starting to override the cold. I tried to focus on warming my core when I heard the sound. It was faint, muffled by the raging storm, but definite, a high-pitched, desperate cry for help. It wasn't the wind, it was human. My heart sank, another person stranded. The humanitarian impulse immediately warred with the primal survival instinct. My supplies were critically low. I couldn't help them effectively, and they could jeopardize my own slender chances. I unzipped my bivvy just enough to peek out into the swirling white chaos. I couldn't see anything. I closed it again. A few minutes later, the cry was closer. It was a man's voice, hoarse and ragged. "Help, is anyone here?" The voice sounded like it was right outside my pine shelter. "Stay there," I shouted, my voice sounding weak against the wind's roar. I'm injured, don't move. A shadow appeared in the opening of the pines, a dark, bulky figure covered in snow. He stumbled into the shelter, collapsing a few feet from me. He was clearly hypothermic, shivering violently and moving with slow, clumsy desperation. "Thank God," he gasped, his voice rattling. "I saw your tracks before the snow covered them. I thought I was done." He was wearing an expensive ski shell but no hat, and his face was stark white. He had a pack, but it looked strangely deflated. I forced myself to be calm. "I'm Mark. I've broken my leg. We're sheltered here, but the sat phone is down. We need to conserve heat." "David," he wheezed, rubbing his hands together. I lost my pack, slipped. Everything, just this." He patted a small fanny pack around his waist. A wave of dread washed over me. Lost his pack. That meant he was a total liability, consuming my resources without contributing. I opened my thermos and poured him maybe an ounce of lukewarm tea. He drained it instantly. "You have a stove?" he asked, his eyes wide and too bright. "Yes, but we use it sparingly. We need to melt snow for water, but we can't afford to burn through all the fuel for warmth." He nodded, but his eyes were darting around my small pile of survival gear. They fixed on the small, bright red fuel canister. We settled into a grim silence, the storm still raging outside. I tried to stay awake, monitoring my injury and my internal temperature. Around 11:25 p.m., the air inside the pine shelter was freezing, but bearable. David, however, began to move restlessly. "I can't stop shaking," he whispered, his voice thin. "I need more heat, just a little. A fire, maybe." "No," I hissed. "The snow is too deep for a fire and we don't have dry kindling. We stay put, conserve." He didn't argue. He just kept watching my fuel canister. And that's when the little voice of paranoia started screaming in my head. Is he really that cold, or is he calculating? I slid my hand under my sleeping bag and checked the location of my knife. A minute later, David suddenly spoke, his voice too casual. "You know, with your leg, you're not going to be making it out tomorrow, even if the storm breaks. I have the sat phone. If the signal comes back, I call for help." "If," he repeated, the word hanging like an icicle. He shifted, pulling something out of his fanny pack. It was a large, heavy carabiner. "Tell me, Mark," he said, turning his body toward me. "How much fuel is left in that red tin? Enough for one person to make it 2 days, maybe." That was it. The mask was off. The distressed hiker was gone, replaced by a desperate opportunist. He wasn't going to share my remaining survival window. My mind raced. I was injured, trapped in a sleeping bag, and he was between me and my gear. He was bigger than me, and though he was clearly suffering from exposure, he was still mobile. He lunged. It wasn't a fight. It was a desperate tangle. He slammed the carabiner down, aiming for my temple, but I managed to roll my torso. And the heavy metal piece hit the ground with a dull thud. The force of his movement tore the zipper of my sleeping bag open. He grabbed for the fuel canister, but I was faster. I grabbed my trekking pole, the one still taped to my broken leg, and swung it like a club. Crack! The fiberglass pole struck him across the side of the head. It wasn't enough to knock him out, but it bought me a split second. He recoiled, clutching his ear, swearing violently. I used the time to grab my tiny stove and fuel and shove them deep into the snow outside my pine cave, hidden from his view. Then I grabbed my knife and held it up, the blade catching the faint, diffused light. "It's gone, David," I gasped, pain shooting up my leg. "The fuel is gone. You tried to hit me. Now you get nothing." He looked at my empty hands, then back at the exposed, snow-covered ground where he knew the items had been moments before. His eyes glazed over, the calculated malice dissolving into raw, panicked despair. "No, you can't," he stammered. "I need it. I'll die without it." "We're both dying, David," I whispered. "But you chose your way. You get nothing from me now. We sit, we wait, and we both hope the sun rises. He backed away slowly, defeated. The fight had drained the last of his warmth. He huddled against the opposite wall of the shelter, shivering uncontrollably. The quick freeze was doing my dirty work. I watched him. I didn't hate him. I was just cold, in pain, and utterly terrified of him. I kept the knife ready, listening to the agonizing sound of his deteriorating breathing. The storm raged for another 2 hours. Sometime after 1 a.m., the wind suddenly began to subside. By 2:35 a.m., the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound, terrifying silence. I waited until I heard only the gentle, shallow sound of his breathing. Then slowly, painfully, I reached out, grabbed a handful of his discarded ski shell and gave him a gentle shove. He didn't respond. He was gone, claimed by the cold. I waited until the first sliver of dawn painted the eastern sky pink. With my good leg, I kicked a hole in the snow, found my stove and fuel, and carefully started melting snow. I made a weak cup of tea, held the warm metal against my face, and hit the satellite phone button again. This time, the signal found a satellite. The dispatcher on the other end, his voice calm and professional, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It took the helicopter crew 6 excruciating hours to reach my coordinates. As the rescue basket descended, I looked at David's still, frozen form. I told the rescuers I found him that way. I told myself it was the cold that killed him, not the choices he made, and certainly not my own survival instinct. But as they lifted me into the sky, I clutched the red fuel tin to my chest. The mountain was brutally efficient at separating the living from the dead, and I realized I had just been handed a terrible, permanent lesson in the cost of survival. Story 5. The air was thick with the scent of hemlock and wet earth. I was on a multi-day hike deep in the Olympic National Forest, aiming for a lookout point that promised a rare view of the coastline. I'd spent the last few hours scrambling up a steep, overgrown deer trail that ran adjacent to a massive, forested canyon, a place that felt entirely untouched by human hands. I reached the top of the canyon ridge just as the sun was starting its slow, crimson descent. The view was incredible, but it wasn't the distant ocean that stopped me cold. It was the cabin nestled in the valley floor far below. It was a dilapidated gray structure, clearly not intended for rental or recreation. It was completely isolated, tucked beside a fast-moving river, with a single, battered pickup truck parked clumsily next to it. No trails led to it. It looked like a place accessible only by logging road, or maybe a dangerous river crossing. I set my pack down and pulled out my binoculars. My plan was to make a cold camp right there on the ridge, enjoy the sunset, and then descend in the morning. That's when I saw the 3 men. They were standing outside the cabin, silhouetted against the dark tree line. They weren't dressed like hikers or hunters. They were wearing rough, dark clothes, and they moved with a kind of heavy, low-to-the-ground menace. As I watched, a 4th figure emerged from the cabin, stumbling. This was a woman. She was smaller than the men and looked terrified, her hands bound tightly behind her back with what looked like thick plastic zip ties. My stomach churned. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This was an abduction, a holding. The man closest to her, the biggest of the 3, shoved her violently toward the back of the pickup. She tripped, and as she fell, a beam of light from the setting sun caught a flash of metal in the big man's hand. A short-barreled shotgun. I instinctively dropped flat onto the pine needles, pulling my binoculars down. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought the drumming would carry down to the valley floor. I was probably 400 feet above them, hidden by dense fir trees in the distance, but the certainty that I had just seen something I shouldn't have was a physical chill. They forced the woman into the bed of the truck, throwing a heavy tarp over her. The 2 smaller men got into the cab, and the big man with the shotgun got in the passenger side. The truck started with a roar and lurched forward, heading down a barely visible dirt track that wound deeper into the canyon. They were leaving. They were moving their prisoner. My mind started racing, cycling through impossible options. Hike back now and call the police. That would take hours to get a signal, and by then the truck would be long gone. Go down there and try to help. I was one person armed with a multi-tool against 3 armed men. Suicide. Then a terrifying possibility dawned on me. What if this wasn't the only cabin? What if they were just moving her to another location? What if they were coming back for something they left? I made the most difficult decision of my life. I had to get closer to the cabin and find proof, something concrete to tell the police that wasn't just my word against 3 criminals. The risk was insane, but if I walked away, that woman was probably dead. I waited until the sound of the truck's engine was completely gone, swallowed by the dense forest. The sun had set, and the canyon was plunging into a thick, starless night. The descent was brutal. I wasn't on a trail. I was bushwhacking, sliding down slick rock faces, grabbing at roots, and trying to avoid spraining an ankle. I moved with a desperate, silent intensity, fueled by adrenaline and a growing fear that the men might double back. It took over an hour to reach the valley floor. When I finally stepped onto the riverbank, my legs were shaking, and my clothes were soaked with sweat and dew. The air around the cabin was heavy and silent. I approached cautiously, moving through the undergrowth. There was no light inside, and the only sound was the rush of the river. I crept up to the cabin's single, warped window. I could smell stale cigarette smoke and something acrid, metallic, like old blood. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Why leave the door unlocked? Did they leave something behind, or were they expecting someone else to show up? I slipped inside, pulling a small, red-filtered tactical light from my pack. The filter was key. It preserved my night vision and was less likely to be seen from a distance. The room was sparse. A single cot, a beat-up table, and 3 overturned chairs. My light beam swept across the floor, and I saw it. Near the cot, partially covered by a threadbare rug, was a large patch of dark, dried fluid. Definitely blood. But worse, tucked underneath the cot was a cheap, plastic-handled shovel, its edge caked with wet soil and a smear of the same dark stain. My mind supplied the horrific narrative. They had done something terrible here, cleaned up poorly, and were now moving the witness, the woman, to a final disposal site. I needed evidence of who they were. I checked the table. 2 empty beer cans, the cheap, low-end kind. And then I saw it, a crumpled receipt from a tiny, distant gas station, time-stamped this morning. The name of the station was faint but legible, printed next to a string of numbers. I snatched the receipt and tucked it into my zippered chest pocket. That was my proof. That was enough. As I turned to leave, my foot kicked something on the floor. It rolled across the rough wood and stopped against the wall. It was a key. A single brass car key, clearly too small for the heavy pickup. If that key didn't belong to the men, who did it belong to? And what did it open? I pocketed the key, now carrying 3 pieces of dangerous information. The receipt, the key, and the memory of the woman's terrified face. I scrambled back out the door, adrenaline lending me wings. I had to get out of the canyon before dawn. I was halfway across the river stones when the sound hit me. The unmistakable, distant roar of a truck engine starting up again. They were back. I dove behind a cluster of dense alders, pressing myself flat into the damp earth. The headlights cut through the night, bobbing wildly as the pickup bounced down the rough track. They pulled right up to the cabin. 3 doors opened and slammed shut. I could hear their voices now, closer and clearer than before. "I swear I left it on the table," the big man growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "That receipt is the only proof we were even out here, the one with the mileage." "It doesn't matter, Duke," one of the smaller men replied, his voice tinny with anxiety. "The girl's gone, that's what matters. We need to burn this place down and get out." No, we left too many prints. We need the paper trail, you idiot. We clean this up and we burn it. Find that receipt. And check the ground around the entrance. I feel like I heard something when we first left. They were searching for the receipt, and they were paranoid. I was maybe 20 yards from the cabin, separated from them by the river and the dense tree cover. But the sound of the river was also working against me. It masked my movements, but it masked theirs too. I had to move up the canyon, parallel to the road they took, to circle around them and get back to the ridge. I started a silent crawl, moving only when I heard their voices muffled by the cabin walls. I crawled for 10 agonizing minutes until I was sure I was past them. I rose into a crouch and started walking fast, keeping off the road, when a beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness right in front of me. Hold it right there. It was the smallest of the 3 men. He hadn't gone inside. He had been circling the perimeter, hunting for tracks in the soft earth. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, plunging deeper into the trees, away from the cabin and the road. He yelled, a sharp, panicked sound, followed by 2 more yells as the other men realized what was happening. I heard running footsteps behind me, then the chilling sound of the shotgun being racked. I ducked behind a massive, moss-covered tree as the boom ripped through the silence, tearing a hole in the air. The shot was wide, splattering harmlessly into the leaves above my head, but the shockwave nearly knocked me down. I kept running, pushing through the thick undergrowth, scrambling up a near-vertical embankment. I had to get higher, where the trees were sparse, and they couldn't track me as easily. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision tunneled. When I finally reached the exposed, rocky slope of the ridge line, the same ridge I'd been on hours ago, I risked one look back. I could see the 3 flashlights bobbing like malevolent fireflies down in the valley. They had reached the base of the ridge and were starting to climb, shouting threats that were lost in the distance. I ran harder, scrambling up the loose shale. I knew where I was going. I had to reach the old fire lookout tower 10 miles east. It was the only place I knew of with a solid radio antenna and a chance for a cell signal. I ran along the ridge, the cold wind whipping my face. I didn't stop until I saw the faint, rusted silhouette of the tower against the pre-dawn sky. I reached the base of the tower and clawed my way up the creaking metal stairs, not caring about the noise. I reached the tiny, glassed-in cabin and, with trembling hands, pulled out my phone. One fragile bar of signal. I dialed 911. As the phone connected, I looked out the dusty window. The sun was just rising, and far below in the gray-green canyon, I could no longer see the bobbing flashlights. They were either still searching, or they had given up and fled. 911, what is your emergency? I've witnessed a crime, I gasped into the phone, my voice raw and broken. 3 men, a kidnapped woman. I have the location and I have evidence. Send help immediately. I'm at the old. I didn't finish the sentence. The knowledge that I had proof, that the woman's fate was now in the hands of the police, brought a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief, followed by the terrifying realization that they now knew I existed. The hunters were gone, but they knew what I looked like. My hike was over, and a new, more dangerous chapter had just begun. Story 6. The North Woods of Maine are famous for their solitude, but the kind of solitude I found on the 100-mile wilderness was starting to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum. It was a cold, late September afternoon. I'd been hiking alone for over a week, and the trail ahead of me was nothing but a tunnel of ancient pines, silence and fog. I was crossing a section of rocky trail near a small, still black lake, trying to make good time before the sun vanished entirely. I stopped to adjust a strap on my pack, and when I looked up, I saw him. Maybe 30 yards ahead, walking at the same steady, rhythmic pace as I was another hiker. Standard hiking gear, dark green jacket, gray pack, trekking poles. I was initially relieved. A human being, I called out, "Hey, How far to the shelter? The hiker didn't stop, didn't turn around, just kept walking, disappearing around a tight bend in the trail. I shrugged. Maybe they had earbuds in. I picked up my pace, jogging slightly to catch up. When I rounded the bend, the trail straightened and the woods opened up a little. The figure was still there, maybe 50 yards out now. And that's when the first spike of pure, crystalline dread hit me. The jacket was the same faded shade of dark green as mine. The pack was the same model and color, a gray Osprey Atmos 50. The gaiters were the same brand of bright red. I slowed down, feeling a strange tightening in my chest. Coincidence, I thought, popular gear. But then the man raised his arm to wipe his brow, and I saw the band on his wrist. It was a wide black fitness tracker, the exact, slightly scuffed model I was wearing. I stopped dead. He was now maybe 100 yards away. Something was profoundly, sickeningly wrong. I raised my hand instinctively to my face, then touched the scratch on my cheek I'd gotten yesterday. The man ahead of me did the exact same thing. He touched his hand to his cheek in the identical spot, in an identical gesture. My blood ran cold. I pulled my binoculars out of the side pocket, my hands trembling violently. I zoomed in on the figure's back. He turned his head slightly to look into the woods, a momentary, casual movement, and for a fraction of a second I saw his profile. It was my profile. My nose, my jawline, the way my dark hair fell slightly over my ears. It was me, my doppelganger. I stumbled backward, leaning against a tree for support. My mind fractured, cycling through every rational explanation. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, a psychological break. Am I hallucinating? Is this some kind of rare, Mountain-specific delirium? I pinched my arm hard. I felt the pain. I closed my eyes and counted to 20. When I opened them, he was still there, now standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, looking back at me. He hadn't just turned, he was waiting. The distance was too great to make out his expression, but I knew what I would see if I got closer. My own face, watching me. Was this a trick of the light and paranoia, or was someone staging this terrifying confrontation? And if so, why? He started walking again, slowly at first, then picking up the pace until he was moving just fast enough to be a continuous, receding target. He was leading me. I decided against every fiber of my survival instinct to follow. I had to know. If I was going crazy, I needed proof. If this was a person, I needed to confront them. I ran, silent on the pine needles, driven by a raw, desperate need for clarity. I chased him for 20 minutes, through dense woods and over small creeks. He never slowed. He never looked back again, but he maintained the exact, maddening distance. As the light began to fail, the trail led into a vast, boulder-strewn clearing that opened onto a high ridge. The wind picked up, howling through the exposed rock formations. The doppelganger reached the center of the clearing and for the first time stopped completely. He set his pack down gently on a flat slab of granite. He then turned to face me. I was 50 yards away, hidden partially behind the mouth of the tree line. The low blue light of the coming night threw his figure into sharp relief. He was definitely me. The height, the build, the gear, but his posture was unnatural. He was standing with his hands completely limp at his sides, his head slightly tilted. He was waiting for me to close the gap. I reached for my trekking pole, extending the shaft, preparing for a fight. "Who are you?" I yelled, my voice cracking and swallowed by the wind. He didn't respond. He just stood there. Then he raised his right hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed. He wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The clearing was wide and the shadows were thick. I saw nothing, just the jagged silhouette of the pine trees. When I turned back, the doppelganger was gone. His pack was still there, sitting exactly where he dropped it in the center of the granite slab. But he had vanished into the darkening woods, silently, impossibly fast. I took a deep, shuddering breath and walked cautiously toward the abandoned pack. If he wasn't real, why did he leave a physical object? If he was real, why did he leave his vital gear? I reached the granite slab. The pack was an identical gray osprey. As I touched it, the material felt cold and damp. The zippers were undone. I looked inside. It was empty, completely empty, save for a thin layer of dry pine needles at the bottom. The pack had been abandoned or, worse, planted. But tucked into a side mesh pocket, something caught the last flicker of light. It was a small, sealed plastic bag, and inside it was a single item, a photograph. I pulled it out and held it up to the faint light. It was a picture of me. Not a selfie, but a candid shot taken a few days ago, wearing the same clothes, standing next to my tent at a shelter 5 miles back. The photo was slightly blurry, clearly taken from a distance, hidden in the trees. The terror became absolute, blinding realization. This wasn't a hallucination. This was stalking. Someone was out here playing a cruel, elaborate psychological game. They had followed me, studied my gear, dressed like me, and planted an empty pack to draw me into this exposed clearing at dusk. And then I remembered his last action, pointing behind me. He wasn't pointing at a threat I needed to see. He was pointing at the direction he wanted me to run. He was luring me away from something. I grabbed the pack and started running the opposite direction he'd pointed, back toward the tree line, back down the trail I'd just come up. I was maybe 10 yards from the safety of the pines when I heard a low, metallic whirring sound coming from the spot where the doppelganger had been standing. I spun around. The sound was coming from the ground near the granite slab. I could see a flash of white light, not a flashlight but a blinding, momentary strobe, and then another. The flash was followed by a sound I couldn't place, a heavy, swooshing noise, like something massive being dragged quickly across the ground. Whatever it was large, dangerous, and it was moving out of the clearing, coming in my direction. The doppelganger hadn't been a warning. He was a distraction designed to make me look away while the real threat was activated. I dove behind the thickest pine I could find, wrapping my arms around the rough bark. I stayed there, shaking, listening to the heavy, uneven sounds of something moving through the brush nearby. It was slow now, deliberate, searching the area. I spent the next 3 hours in that spot, curled tight, the photograph of my own unsuspecting face a crumpled piece of plastic in my pocket. The sound of the thing, be it man or machine or animal, came and went, a slow, terrifying circuit around the perimeter of the clearing. I knew I couldn't stay. As midnight approached, the cold began to leach through my layers. I waited for the longest stretch of silence. When the wind howled, drowning out all other sound, I moved. I didn't take the trail. I plunged into the darkest, densest part of the forest, crawling on my hands and knees, scrambling over wet rocks and mossy logs. I didn't care about my direction. I just cared about leaving the clearing, the doppelganger's pack, and the thing that was circling it. I hiked straight off trail until 4 a.m., guided only by the distant, faint outline of the Big Dipper. When I finally stumbled onto an old, abandoned logging road, I knew I was safe from the immediate threat. I never found out who was hunting me, or why they had chosen the terrifying motif of my own identity. But I knew one thing for certain. Someone had spent serious time, effort, and resources to study me and lure me into that trap. As I walked, exhausted but alive, down the gravel road toward the rising sun, the memory of that figure, my face, my gear, pointing me toward danger, became the chilling, permanent fear that the wilderness held not just monsters, but people determined to turn your own self against you. I survived the trap, but I'd never again look at my reflection in a pond the same way. Story 7. The Ozark National Forest in late fall is stunning, but deceptive. The ground is a carpet of dry, fallen leaves, masking every root and hole. I was maybe 2 days into a wilderness section, following a faint, unmaintained path that was supposed to cut 20 miles off my loop. It was a beautiful, isolated spot, so quiet you could hear the blood rushing in your ears. I was crossing a small, shallow ravine, stepping carefully over a dry stream bed. I felt confident, focused on my footing, when the world violently inverted. It wasn't a trip or a slide. It was a sudden, sickening drop, followed by a snapping sound, and then excruciating, localized pain. I was on the ground, my right leg twisted at an unnatural angle. My pack flipped over my head. I sat up, gasping, trying to understand what happened. I hadn't just tripped, my right foot was gone. I looked down, my hands scrambling away the crunchy leaves. My leg was perfectly straight, jammed down into a narrow, dark hole, maybe 8 inches wide. The hole was camouflaged brilliantly, covered with a thin, brittle layer of woven brush and leaves that had given way instantly under my weight. And the sickening part, around my ankle something rough and heavy was cinched tight, a rope. I was in a snare, a massive, crude game trap meant for a deer or possibly a small bear. I tried to pull my leg out, but the pain was immediate and searing. The rope, which looked like thick, braided nylon, had a self-tightening slipknot that was biting deep into my hiking boot leather and, more worryingly, into my ankle. The more I pulled, the tighter it cinched. I was literally rooted to the ground, maybe 50 yards off a seldom-used trail, with a trapped leg and a skyrocketing sense of panic. I pulled out my multi-tool and opened the blade. The nylon was far too thick to cut quickly, and trying to saw through it at this awkward angle with my body weight resting on my spine was nearly impossible. Worse, the knife kept slipping, grazing my pant leg right above the tightening knot. Why would anyone set a trap this crude and this effective on what might generously be called a public path? Illegal hunting was one thing, but this was a serious, dangerous hazard, a felony if a human was caught in it. I worked at the rope for 10 agonizing minutes, sweat stinging my eyes, cutting through maybe 2 of the 6 strands before I had to stop. The sun was getting low, throwing long, spooky shadows across the ravine. I listened only the wind. I was safe for now. But a hunter who sets a trap like this doesn't just walk away and forget it. They come back. They check. How long had the trap been there? And how soon was the person who set it planning to check their catch? I pulled out my phone, predictably no signal. I was alone, injured, and rapidly losing daylight. I redoubled my efforts, focusing solely on the rope. I'd saw through another strand, then rest, then saw again, ignoring the throbbing pain that was now a dull, continuous roar. I was maybe halfway through the nylon rope, praying I'd be free before I was plunged into darkness, when I heard it. It wasn't a hiking boot crunching leaves. It was the distinct sound of motorized movement. Far off, but definitely getting closer, was the low, persistent thrumming of an ATV engine laboring up the hill. My stomach dropped. It was him, the trapper, and he wasn't arriving on foot, he was riding. He was on a routine check, maybe grabbing his kill before the coyotes got to it, and he was about to find me instead. I knew instinctively that whoever set this trap wasn't going to call for an ambulance. They were going to see me, a witness, a liability, and a human caught in an illegal trap, and they were going to panic. I had maybe 10 minutes before he crested the rise. I jammed the knife back onto the rope, sawing with frantic, desperate energy. The blade was dulling fast, and the remaining nylon strands were resisting fiercely. The ATV engine sound was louder now, closer. I could hear the grinding of the gears. I gave up on the knife. It was too slow. My only chance was to break the rope or break my leg trying. I jammed my hands into the hole, grasping the section of rope still attached to the root structure deep underground. I pulled. I strained. I screamed into the ground. Nothing. The rope was anchored to something solid, a root or rock buried too deep to budge. I had to hide. I had to disappear. I looked around the small ravine. My pack was right next to me, a big, bright green beacon. I shoved it quickly under a thick mat of tangled briars 20 feet away, using my free leg to kick a handful of leaves over it. The ATV was very close now, maybe a minute away. I could hear the rhythmic whir-chug-whir clearly. I was still trapped, exposed, lying on the ground. I had to create a distraction, a displacement. There was a large, flat slab of shale rock maybe 5 feet from me. Using my elbows and my good leg, I dragged my useless, trapped body toward the rock, scraping myself raw on the debris. I reached the edge of the shale and then, with a final surge of adrenaline, I kicked out with my free leg, sending the heavy rock tumbling down the ravine into the dry stream bed. It crashed and clattered loudly, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet woods. Immediately the sound of the ATV engine stopped. Silence. Heavy, ominous silence. He heard it. He knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the leaves, desperately hoping the movement of the rock would draw his initial focus to the ravine bed, and not to the small, perfectly camouflaged hole I was pinned to. A minute later, I heard the crunch of heavy boots leaving the trail. Then, a low, guttural voice muffled by the trees. "Hello, anyone there?" His voice was rough, uneducated, and laced with immediate suspicion. He wasn't calling out of concern. He was checking for witnesses. I held my breath, closing my eyes, concentrating on making myself small. I heard his footsteps stop near where the rock landed. Then, a slow, deliberate movement as he circled the ravine, searching. I heard the snapping of a twig right near the entrance to my trap. Then the worst sound of all. He was moving away from the rock, toward the general area of my position. He was not looking for a lost hiker. He was looking for a snare. The footsteps stopped maybe 10 feet away. I could hear his heavy, rasping breath. "Well, now what have we here?" he murmured, a cold, dry chuckle in his voice. My eyes snapped open. He hadn't seen me. He had seen my trap hole. He knelt down, peering at the perfectly round opening and the frayed edges of the camouflage cover. He was examining his workmanship. "Must have been a big one," he muttered to himself, reaching a gloved hand down toward the taut rope. "Pulled hard, didn't ya?" He reached down, felt the tension of the rope, and then, slowly, he started following the line of the rope with his hand, like a spider tracing a web. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the moment his hand would brush against my pant leg. I had one last, desperate idea. I reached out with my hand and grabbed a handful of leaves and dirt. The instant his hand touched the rough canvas of my boot, I opened my eyes and shouted. "Hey!" I shouted not in terror but in surprise, as if I had just stumbled upon his trap. At the same moment, I threw the handful of dirt and debris straight up into the air, aiming for his face. The man lurched back with a surprised grunt, his hands flying up to shield his eyes from the grit. I used that split second to act. I didn't try to pull my leg out. I grabbed the remaining nylon strands with my knife hand and jammed the blade deep into the wood of the root structure beneath me. I twisted the knife violently, using the leverage to pull the rope out of the hole, hopping to dislodge the entire anchoring root structure. It worked. With a horrible splintering crack, the rotting root gave way, tearing free from the ground. The noose was still tight on my ankle, but the anchor was gone. I was free of the hole. I scrambled away from the man, dragging my entire leg behind me, the noose still attached to the useless, splintered root. The man was sputtering, wiping the dirt from his eyes. He saw me, a half-crawling mess with a broken-looking leg, and he finally understood what had happened. He didn't grab the rope. He reached to his belt. I saw the glint of a heavy, curved skinning knife. You broke my trap," he bellowed, his voice filled with primal rage. He started toward me, but he was slow, off balance. I had gained maybe 20 feet. I used my arms to drag myself backward away from him, toward a low, thorny thicket. I reached the briars, scrambled under them, and then, using the pain as fuel, I found a large, dead tree branch, maybe 4 feet long. I jammed the branch under the rope near my ankle and used it as a crude lever, twisting it quickly. The nylon gave way with a final, desperate snap. I was free. I crawled deeper into the thicket, leaving the rope and the splintered root behind. The man reached the edge of the briars but hesitated. They were too dense, too thorny for him to push through quickly, especially in the fading light. "You're not going anywhere, boy," he yelled, waving the skinning knife. "I know these woods. I'll find you by sunup." I didn't answer. I just kept crawling, pushing through the thorny undergrowth, favoring my good leg until I felt myself go over the edge of the ravine. Not the shallow one, but a huge, deep wash I hadn't seen before. I tumbled down, the thick vegetation breaking my fall, landing in a pile of soft, dry leaves. I was battered, my ankle was a screaming wreck, but I was hidden. As I lay there, listening to the man's furious shouts fading into the distance, I knew my hike was over. I had to wait until the dead of night, then crawl out toward the main highway, maybe 5 agonizing miles away. He knew a human had been in his snare. He knew I had escaped, and he knew the area. I had won the battle in the ravine, but the night was long and the true danger of the woods, not the animals but the hunter, was still waiting for me. I had to move or become his next, more permanent trap. Story 8. The air at 10,000 feet was thin, cold, and smelled exactly like the expensive cedar box tucked deep inside my pack. The box contained the ashes of my great-aunt Vivian. My uncle Walter had made it clear. The only way to get my piece of her considerable estate was to be present when her ashes were scattered at the summit of her favorite, incredibly remote peak, Mount Cinder. There were 5 of us on this trek. Myself, Uncle Walter, my cousins Clara and Ethan, and a professional guide, Finn. We were heirs, and this wasn't a hike. It was a mandatory multi-day family obligation, steeped in resentment and the promise of millions. Right from the start, the atmosphere was thick with forced politeness and thinly veiled animosity. We weren't a family. We were rivals wearing expensive hiking gear. The first 2 days were all about physical endurance, ignoring the tension. But as we climbed higher, the tension started to solidify into something else: paranoia. It began with Clara. She was ahead of me on a particularly narrow, foggy section of scree. She suddenly stumbled, crying out as her foot slipped on a patch of loose rock. She recovered quickly, but as I passed her, I saw her glaring at the cousin directly ahead of her, Ethan. Later that afternoon, when we stopped for water, I asked her if she was okay. She leaned in, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan did it, Mark. He kicked the rock loose, just enough to make me fall. He knew I wouldn't lose my footing there otherwise." I dismissed it as altitude jitters and sibling rivalry. Ethan was a snake, but a literal attempt at murder seemed extreme, even for a few $1 million. But that night, the paranoia spread to me. We set up camp near a small alpine lake. Walter, my uncle and the trustee, insisted on securing the large group tent himself. As he hammered the final stake into the frozen ground, I noticed that Finn, the guide, was watching him, not with professionalism, but with a strange, calculating intensity. Later, around the small, sputtering campfire, Walter was the life of the party, telling loud, inappropriate stories. He took a long, deep swig from his water bottle. A minute later, he stopped talking mid-sentence. His eyes glazed over. He dropped the bottle and swayed, clutching his head. "My head, the pressure. I need to lie down." He stumbled into his tent, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. Ethan, ever the opportunistic one, immediately spoke up. "Altitude sickness happens to the best of them." "He's fine," Clara said, her voice tight. "But I think we should check his tent stakes, just to be sure he's not too secure." Was Walter's sudden illness due to the altitude, or was someone in the group giving him a nut out of the way? I decided I needed to get some clarity. I found Finn packing up the communal gear. "Finn," I whispered, "did Walter seem okay to you? And those tent stakes, is everything secure?" Finn didn't look up. This mountain is unforgiving, Mark. People get sick, people make mistakes. As for the stakes, they're set. He's safe for now, but you should keep your eyes open. This whole thing feels wrong." His voice was low, non-committal, and chillingly pragmatic. He was a guide, not a bodyguard, and he clearly saw the five of us as dangerous variables. I zipped myself into my own tent, but I didn't sleep. My hand rested on the cedar box inside my pack, the ashes suddenly feeling less like a memorial and more like a MacGuffin. Around 2 a.m., the cold was profound. I heard a zipper hiss softly, followed by the faint sound of boots moving carefully over the gravel outside. I unzipped my own tent, just enough to peer out into the silver-blue darkness. A figure bundled in dark clothing was standing outside Walter's tent. It was Ethan. He didn't go in. He knelt down beside the tent near the vent opening and was doing something small, meticulous, near the base of the fabric. It was too dark to see clearly, but his posture was focused and predatory. Then he stood up, quietly brushed his hands off, and melted back toward his own tent. My heart hammered against my ribs. Did he just sabotage Walter's tent again? Was it an air vent he was tampering with to make his altitude sickness worse? I waited 5 minutes, then crawled out. I crept over to Walter's tent and knelt down. I didn't dare go inside. I checked the area where Ethan had been fiddling. I found a small, sharp rock wedged directly against the zipper line of the vent, placed in such a way that if Walter tried to open the vent in the morning, the zipper would snag and tear, preventing him from getting proper ventilation. A petty act of sabotage, but a clear sign of bad intent. But that wasn't all. Nearby, carefully pressed into the snow, was a single long piece of copper wire, maybe a foot long, bent into a hook shape. It was too deliberate to be random trash. It looked like the kind of wire used in rudimentary tripwires. I removed the wire and the rock, pocketing both. I returned to my tent, my mind reeling. Ethan was actively trying to incapacitate Walter, possibly to force an early retreat before the summit, thereby invalidating his own claim or perhaps eliminating the competition entirely. The summit was less than a 6-hour climb away. The scattering was scheduled for 9 a.m. I had to assume the next 6 hours would be the most dangerous. The moment the gray light of dawn broke, I woke the group. Walter emerged, groggy and pale, complaining of a splitting headache. "We have to go now," I insisted, not looking at Ethan. "Walter is sick. The faster we get this done, the faster we can descend." We packed up fast. The final climb was brutal, a scramble up sheer rock faces and a narrow, exposed spine. I positioned myself last, keeping a close eye on everyone. As we navigated the most dangerous section, a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop, Ethan was again just ahead of Clara. I watched his movements like a hawk. He wasn't kicking rocks. He was doing something worse. He reached a tight corner where the path was barely a foot wide, and he subtly placed his trekking pole across the trail, creating a temporary ankle-high barrier, then yanked it away the instant he stepped over it. Clara, following 2 steps behind, didn't see the quick movement. Her foot caught the air where the pole had been. She stumbled violently, catching herself only by slamming her hand against the rock face. I saw it, Finn saw it. Ethan looked back, his face a mask of false concern. "Careful, Clara, it's slick here," he called out. Finn, who was climbing behind me, looked at me and shook his head, a look of profound disgust crossing his face. The message was clear. My own cousins were willing to risk serious injury, even death, for a bigger slice of the pie. The accident on the mountain would look exactly like altitude fatigue or a moment of carelessness. We reached the summit at 8:45 a.m. It was a flat, wind-whipped expanse of granite. We stood in a tight, shivering circle. Walter, looking miserable, held the cedar box. "Aunt Vive wanted to be here," he wheezed. "Let's be quick." He opened the box. The wind immediately caught the fine, gray ash and blew it sideways, creating a swirling, ghostly curtain. Walter scattered the ashes. We all stood silently, watching the wind take them. As the last of the ash was gone, the ritual complete, I felt a surge of relief. It was over. But then, the final, chilling piece clicked into place. Ethan smiled, a wide, genuine, relieved smile. Well, that's done. Now the descent. But Walter didn't move. He stood, frozen, looking at the empty box. Mark, he said, his voice flat, the will. It states that the scattering must be witnessed by all 5 heirs and the trustee must be of sound mind. He turned and looked at my cousins, his eyes suddenly clear and sharp. I'm the trustee, but if I were to fall ill or be deemed incapacitated, the contingency plan is that the estate is frozen for 5 years and the bulk of it goes to charity. He had tricked them. He wasn't sick, or if he was recovering fast. He had watched them try to sabotage him, and his illness had been a calculated test. Suddenly, Ethan's face went white with fury. He lunged at Walter, grabbing the empty cedar box. You knew, you set this up. The moment was total chaos. I reacted instantly. I shoved Ethan hard, sending him stumbling back against the granite. But it wasn't Ethan who was the final threat. As I moved, Clara grabbed the small rock hammer from Finn's pack, which he'd set down during the ceremony. She didn't aim for Walter, she aimed for me. She wasn't trying to scare me, she was trying to eliminate the witness. I dodged, but the hammer grazed my shoulder, sending a spike of pain down my arm. Finn, seeing the shift from rivalry to outright violence, moved like lightning. He stepped between Clara and me, seizing her arm and twisting the hammer away. The hike is over, Finn roared into the wind, his guide persona completely shattered. The inheritance is done. Any injury from this point on will be investigated as attempted murder. The threat, delivered with absolute conviction by the impartial professional, froze them all. Clara stood there, panting, her eyes filled with cold, final rage. Ethan glowered from the ground. Walter stood, clutching his chest, the empty cedar box clutched tight. The descent was the most agonizing part of the trip. We hiked down in a silent, spaced-out line. I walked directly behind Walter and Finn walked directly behind me. We weren't a hiking party. We were a chain of suspects and their guard. The final danger wasn't the mountain, the weather, or a wild animal. It was the fact that I had seen the truth. My own blood was willing to watch me fall from a cliff for $1 million. I had completed the task, but the chilling truth I carried off the mountain was the most dangerous burden of the entire trip.